morning of April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee would make one final attempt to break through the Union lines to keep his army moving west. Well, that attack would fail, and he would soon realize that he was surrounded. Now, the events that would happen after that failed attack bring us to today's location. Today, we are visiting Appomattox Courthouse and the McLean House, where Robert E. Lee would surrender to Ulysses S Grant. Now, something that I'm going to mention, or else I'll definitely forget, is that this didn't mark the end of the Civil War, but what it did was start the end of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee would surrender here, and his army of Northern Virginia of about 28,000 to 30,000 soldiers would surrender, but armies throughout the Confederacy would still take weeks to surrender. And here is the courthouse. Now, Grant chose not to accept Lee's surrender here because at the time it was still a Confederate building. Now, unfortunately, the original courthouse would burn down in a fire in the 1890s, but it has been restored. Now, they also have a visitor center and museum inside, so we're going to go inside and check it out. So now we're in the visitor center, which is at the courthouse. And we're going to start with Lieutenant Colonel George Briggs of the 7th Michigan Cavalry. How cool is that? Now this is a piece of the original flag of truce that the Confederates would present. Man, that's cool. Now this is a battle flag of the Oneida Cavalry out of New York, and it was carried throughout the war. Private Alexander Patterson Watson. He was captured and held at a POW camp in Richmond, and these were his items. Now this one was a souvenir that he got from a Confederate sailor. Really cool. And check that out. Those are two bullets that collided in midair. How crazy is that? Now, obviously a very polarizing event even for that time, but this painting is actually inaccurate. This is the more accurate version. They were at different tables. How cool is that? And here's more depictions here. And this was a towel used by the Confederates, and this would be the first flag used for truce. Now this is the table that the final agreement was signed on. General Lee and Grant, and then the next day, Longstreet, Gordon, Pendleton, and Gibbon, Griffin, and Merritt from the Union side would sign on this table. And here's an example of a rifled musket that would have been carried by a Union soldier, most likely a Springfield, and it would utilize the percussion cap system. Now here's the cavalry coat of Sergeant Augustus Brown of the 10th New York Cavalry. Now when he joined the Union, there were only 34 stars, and when he was laid to rest, a 48-star flag draped his coffin. Here are some of the parole passes that were given out to the Army of Northern Virginia. And this one is handwritten on a $5 Confederate note. It's pretty cool. And here's a few more weapons that would have been carried during that time. A couple sabers and a Spencer repeating rifle. So here's a drum that was carried by the 198th Pennsylvania Infantry, and this is the drum that would have played upon General Lee's arrival at the McLean House. That's pretty cool. And now we're back downstairs, and here's just a few pieces of Robert E. Lee's headquarters flag that would have been carried by his staff. Pretty cool. And these are super cool to see, probably my favorite so far. These are the boots of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who is best known for his actions during the Battle of Gettysburg as a colonel of the 20th Maine. He would actually win the Medal of Honor and survive the war and become Maine's governor. Now before we finish up inside in the museum and head outside, they have a wall that features some of the faces of the soldiers that would have fought here on both sides. Here is Thomas Caldwell, who was a first sergeant in the 7th Michigan. And some of them actually, not only can you see their face, but you can see where they were positioned. He was positioned in the yard of George Piers on the east end of town. So cool to see these stories. Here's the Clover Hill Tavern. Now this is where they would print pardons to the Army of Northern Virginia. I believe almost 30,000 were handed out that day. And now we're in the tavern, and now this is the room where those pardons were printed. How cool is that? And see if you can see that. Here's an example of what those pardons would look like. Cool. Just want to give one more quick look at the room. Just the sheer size of these machines that would have printed these passes. And we're still in the tavern, and they have some few other artifacts that were found here. Check this thing out. This is an artillery limber chest, and what that means is this is where they store the munitions. Now, it was abandoned here at Appomattox after the battle and surrendered. So it's pretty cool to see. Here's a quick glimpse at the Clover Hill Tavern and what it would have looked like. And here's what it looks like today. So now we're going to head over to the McLean House. And here is the McLean House. Now, it was originally built in 1848, and Wilmer McLean would purchase the house in 1863. This is kind of a pretty neat story. Apparently, Wilmer McLean's family lived near where the first Battle of Bull Run would take place in Manassas, Virginia, and in order to avoid the rest of the Civil War, they moved here in Appomattox, Virginia. So that means the war would begin near Wilmer McLean's house and literally end inside Wilmer McLean's house. And now we are inside the main room here, which is the first left just as you walk into the front door, and this is just absolutely awesome. Now, these aren't the original table used by Lee and Grant, but as you can see, they did a really good job reconstructing the scene here. Here's where Lee would have been, and this is where Grant and his staff would have been seated as Lee and Grant would discuss and finalize the terms of the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. This is just so cool to be near this. And here's where the generals and their staff would have been located. Again, here's Lee's desk, and this is where Grant and his staff would have been. Here's a list of the names and positions of everyone that would have attended this meeting, and just one more look at the room and Grant's desk. Can't really see what those papers say, but this is just really, really cool to be here. And here's a bedroom. I believe it's the McLean's bedroom. It's directly across the hallway from the quote-unquote surrender room, but they did a really good job preserving it. And now we are down the stairs, and here is the kitchen area. You can see this is what a kitchen of that time would have looked like. Pretty cool. And across from the kitchen, looks like the McLean dining room, all set up and ready to go. This is what the arrangements would look like. Got some artwork on the walls and a looks like a state-of-the-art Tempur-Pedic bench here. Good for lumbar support. And before we wrap up here today, there was a civilian casualty that was a direct result of the fighting that happened here on the morning of April 9th before the surrender. And a man by the name of Samuel Coleman, who was a doctor, his shed, it looked like, was struck by a Union artillery shell and killed his slave, and his slave's name was Hannah. Now we're behind the McLean House, and here would be the kitchen and storehouse, and here looks like would be the slave quarters. And here's a quick peek at the slave quarters and the living conditions that they would have experienced. As you can see, it's drastically different than what we saw inside.